My name is Elena Martinez, and the last time I trusted my parents with a cup of coffee, I ended up with second-degree burns on my forearm while they demanded I write them a check for $250,000. My mother held the cup steady, looked at my father, and he nodded once. That's when the scalding liquid hit my skin. The other diners at Riverside Bistro turned to look, some gasped, but most just stared and then looked away like they always do when families implode in public. My brother Brandon sat across from me, phone in hand, recording the whole thing with a smirk that told me this wasn't spontaneous. This was planned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't have possibly predicted, was that my grandfather Frank had been sitting 3 tables away the entire time, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses like he was on some kind of undercover mission. And in his weathered leather briefcase sat 30 years of documents, bank statements, property deeds, and recordings that would dismantle every lie my parents had built their comfortable lives upon. Within 20 minutes of that coffee hitting my skin, everything they thought they controlled would start crumbling. But this story isn't really about money, though that's what they'll tell you it was about. It's about being raised to believe that family means unconditional sacrifice, that love is measured in how much you're willing to lose, and that speaking up makes you the villain. It's about discovering that the people who taught you right from wrong were the ones rewriting the rules in their favor all along. So if you've ever been told you owe someone for simply existing, if you've ever been made to feel guilty for wanting what was rightfully yours, if you've ever watched people you love choose greed over integrity, then maybe you'll understand why I let them think they'd won right up until the moment Grandpa Frank stood up, walked over to our table, and said 5 words that changed everything. I have the receipts. Growing up in the Martinez family meant understanding your place in an invisible hierarchy that no one ever explained but everyone enforced. My parents Robert and Patricia built their lives around appearances. The right neighborhood in Laurelhurst with its tree-lined streets and craftsman homes that whispered old money even when there wasn't much left. The right cars in the driveway, always leased, never owned. The right clothes, the right friends, the right Christmas cards with our faces arranged in perfect smiles that never reached our eyes. I learned early that being the youngest and the only daughter meant I existed to reflect well on them. Brandon, for years older, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong even when he was doing everything wrong. He dropped out of Portland State after 1 semester, moved back home, and spent the next decade cycling through jobs that my father secured for him through old connections. Each failure was repackaged as a learning experience, each fired position explained away as a mismatch of vision. When Brandon wrecked his 3rd car in 2 years, my father bought him another one and told him everyone makes mistakes. When I asked to borrow the family car to get to my student teaching placement, my mother told me the bus builds character. I didn't resent it at first. I thought maybe if I was good enough, reliable enough, quiet enough, I'd earn the same grace they gave him so freely. So I worked. I got a partial scholarship to Portland State, worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, graduated with honors in education, and landed a position teaching 5th grade at Bridlemere Elementary. I loved my students, loved the work, loved knowing I was building something that mattered. My salary wasn't impressive by any measure, but it was mine. I'd saved enough for a small apartment in the Pearl District, nothing fancy, just a studio with good light and a view of the street below where food trucks gathered on weekends. My parents came to visit exactly once, 3 weeks after I'd moved in. My mother walked through the front door, glanced around at my carefully arranged space, the plants on the windowsill, the bookshelf I'd assembled myself, and said, "Well, it's cozy." That was her word for disappointing. My father didn't say much. He stood in the center of the room, hands in his pockets, and asked how much I was paying in rent. When I told him, he whistled low and shook his head like I'd admitted to some terrible financial mistake. "You know, you could have just stayed home," he said. "Saved that money." But I didn't want to save that money. I wanted to live my own life. I just didn't say it out loud because I'd learned that wanting things for yourself was considered selfish in our family. The money conversations started small, almost innocent. A call from my mother asking if I could help with the electric bill 1 month, because things were tight. I sent $200. Then it was the property taxes on one of their rental units. Could I chip in $500 just until they sorted out a late tenant payment? I sent it. Then my father needed help covering an unexpected repair on the main house. $1,000 this time. I hesitated, checked my savings account, the one I'd been building carefully for years, and transferred the money because they were my parents and you help family. That's what I'd been taught. That's what good daughters do. But the requests didn't stop. They came more frequently, the amounts grew larger, and the explanations became thinner. My mother started calling them loans, even though we both knew I'd never see that money again. My father began adding interest to the conversation, not officially, just mentions here and there about how much it cost them to raise me, to put me through school, even though I'd paid my own way. The numbers started piling up in ways that didn't make sense. They'd mention casually over dinner that I owed them for things I had no memory of. A car repair from when I was 16. A dental procedure I didn't remember having. Groceries from the years I lived at home. As if childhood hunger was something I should have been invoicing for. Brandon never got these calls. Brandon, who still lived in the guest house behind their property rent-free, who drove a car they paid for, whose credit card bills they covered without question. When I asked my mother once why they didn't ask him for help, she looked at me like I'd said something offensive. Your brother is figuring things out, she said. He needs support right now. And I wanted to ask what I needed, if my working 60-hour weeks and living in a 400-square-foot apartment was somehow less worthy of support, but I already knew the answer. I'd always known. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by certified mail, the kind that requires a signature and makes your stomach drop before you even open it. Inside was a typed document on law office letterhead, Sullivan & Associates, a firm I'd never heard of. The letter was addressed to me and laid out in cold, formal language a debt my parents claimed I owed. $250,000. I read it 3 times because surely I'd misunderstood. But no, there it was, itemized across 2 pages. Loans given over the years, financial support during college, living expenses during my childhood that they were now classifying as parental investment requiring repayment, even a line item for emotional labor. I sat on my apartment floor with that letter in my hands and felt something crack inside me. Not break, not shatter, just crack. Like the first fracture in glass that hasn't fallen apart yet. But you know it will. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and casual like we were just catching up. Did you get the letter? She asked. Not did you receive something upsetting, not are you okay, just a confirmation that the weapon had landed. I asked her if this was real. She sighed, the kind of sigh that's meant to convey patience wearing thin. Elena, we've been more than generous with you over the years, she said. Your father and I have made sacrifices you don't even know about. It's time you took responsibility for your part. My part. I'd been taking care of my part since I was old enough to understand that my needs were negotiable and their comfort wasn't. I asked to see documentation, receipts, proof of these loans they claimed I'd taken. My mother's voice went cold. Are you calling us liars? She asked. Are you really Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Going to sit there and accuse your own parents of dishonesty after everything we've done for you? I wasn't accusing them of anything. I was asking for evidence. But in my family, asking questions was the same as declaring war. That night I pulled out every bank statement I'd saved since I was 18. I went through my email archives, my old planners, every record I could find of money I'd sent them over the years. I added it up 3 times because the number seemed impossible. $47,000. I had given my parents $47,000 over 8 years, in increments small enough that I never saw the total until I forced myself to look. And now they wanted $250,000 more for debts I didn't remember incurring and couldn't verify existed. I called my grandfather the next morning. Frank Martinez lived alone in a small cottage in Selwood, a neighborhood that still felt like old Portland before everything got renovated and expensive. He answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting. I told him about the letter. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that holds weight. Then he said, "Come over tonight. Don't tell your parents. Bring that letter." I asked him if he knew what this was about. He said, "I know more than you think, Elena. And it's time you knew it too. That evening I drove across town as the sun started setting over the West Hills. Grandpa Frank's house smelled like coffee and old books, the kind of place where time moved differently. He sat me down at his kitchen table, poured 2 mugs of coffee from a pot that looked older than I was, and placed a manila folder between us. Inside were documents I'd never seen. Property deeds with my grandmother's name on them. Bank statements showing accounts I didn't know existed. And a will, my grandmother's will, dated 3 months before she passed away 10 years ago. Grandpa Frank slid the will toward me and pointed to a specific paragraph. Your grandmother left you 40% of the rental properties, he said. Not your parents. Not Brandon. You. I stared at the words, reading them over and over. My grandmother, who'd passed when I was 19, had left me nearly half of the Martinez property management portfolio. I'd never known. No one had ever told me. I asked why. Grandpa Frank's jaw tightened. Because your parents never filed this will, he said. They found it after she died, and they buried it. They filed an older version instead, one that left everything to them. The room felt like it was tilting. I asked him how he knew. He tapped the folder. Because your grandmother gave me a copy before she died, he said. She knew what your parents were. She knew they'd try to cut you out. She made me promise I'd watch over you. Make sure you got what was yours when the time was right. I asked why he waited 10 years. His face softened, sad in a way I'd never seen. Because I thought maybe they'd do the right thing on their own, he said. I thought maybe they'd surprise me. But then I saw that letter they sent you, and I knew they never would. We sat there in his small kitchen while the sky outside turned dark, and he walked me through everything. The properties my grandmother had owned outright, purchased decades ago when Portland real estate was still affordable. The rental income those properties generated steady and significant. The way my parents had been collecting that income for 10 years, income that should have been partially mine, and using it to fund their lifestyle while telling me they were struggling. The loans they'd asked me for weren't because they needed money. They were testing how much they could take. And now, with this fabricated debt letter, they were trying to make sure I'd never ask questions about what I was actually owed. I asked Grandpa Frank what I should do. He pushed the folder across the table toward me. You fight, he said. You take this to a lawyer, you contest that fraudulent debt, and you claim what your grandmother wanted you to have. I felt fear rise in my chest, the old familiar fear of rocking the boat, of being the problem, of losing the only family I had. But then I looked at those documents again, at my grandmother's signature, at the properties that bore her name, and I realized I'd already lost my family. I just hadn't been willing to see it yet. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with a lawyer Grandpa Frank recommended, a sharp woman named Linda Foster who specialized in estate disputes and family law. She reviewed everything, asked careful questions, and then looked at me with something like respect. This is fraud, she said plainly. What your parents did is illegal. We can pursue this, but it's going to get ugly. Family cases always do. I asked her what my chances were. She smiled slightly. With this documentation, you'll win. The question is whether you're ready for what comes next. I wasn't sure I was ready, but I was sure I was tired. Tired of being small, of apologizing for existing, of funding their comfort while living on the edge of my own. I told Linda to move forward. She filed a counterclaim against the debt letter, submitted the real will for probate review, and requested a full audit of the Martinez property management accounts for the past 10 years. Within days, my parents knew. My mother called 17 times in one afternoon. I didn't answer. My father left a voicemail, his voice shaking with what he probably thought sounded like hurt, but came across as rage. How could you do this to us, he said. After everything we've given you. How could you be so ungrateful? Ungrateful. That word had been used to control me my entire life. Anytime I wanted something different, anytime I expressed discomfort or set a boundary, I was ungrateful. But I wasn't ungrateful. I was awake. And once you wake up, you can't pretend to sleep anymore. My brother Brandon sent a text. Just one line. You're tearing this family apart. I typed back, they tore it apart 10 years ago, but I never sent it. There was no point. He'd chosen his side long before I'd chosen mine. The weeks that followed felt surreal. I'd go to work, teach my students about fractions and the water cycle, help them navigate playground conflicts and spelling tests, and then I'd come home to emails from lawyers and financial auditors. Linda kept me updated on every development. The properties were being reviewed. The income statements were being traced. My parents had hired their own lawyer, and they were fighting hard, claiming the will I'd presented was forged, that my grandmother had been mentally unfit when she wrote it, that I was manipulating an old man, meaning Grandpa Frank, for financial gain. But the evidence didn't lie. The signatures were verified. The witnesses who'd been present when my grandmother signed her will were tracked down and gave statements. The bank records showed years of rental income flowing into my parents' accounts, income they'd never reported to me, income that legally should have been shared. Every lie they told in response just made the truth sharper. Then came the family meeting. My mother called me directly, bypassing Linda, and asked me to meet them at Riverside Bistro. Just us, she said. No lawyers. Let's talk like family. I knew it was a setup. Linda told me not to go. But part of me, the part that still wanted to believe maybe they'd see reason, maybe they'd apologize, agreed. I told Linda I'd record everything on my phone. She said that was smart and made me promise to stay in a public place. I arrived at Riverside Bistro on a gray Saturday morning. The restaurant sat along the Willamette River, big windows overlooking the water, the kind of place that served overpriced brunch to people who wanted to be seen. My parents were already seated at a table near the back. Brandon was with them. No surprise there. I walked over, heart pounding, and sat down across from them. My mother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She'd ordered coffee for everyone. Four white ceramic cups sat steaming on the table. My father spoke first, his voice measured and calm, the tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. Elena, we need to resolve this situation. You're making things very difficult for everyone. I stayed quiet, my phone recording in my jacket pocket. My mother leaned forward, hands folded on the table like she was about to deliver a prayer. We raised you better than this, she said. Going behind our backs, hiring lawyers, dragging your grandfather into your schemes. Do you have any idea how much pain you're causing? I wanted to laugh at the audacity of it, but I kept my face neutral. Brandon scrolled through his phone, barely present, like this was just another obligation he had to sit through. I asked them why they never told me about Grandma's will. The question landed like a stone in still water. My father's jaw tightened. That will was complicated, he said. There were legal issues. We were protecting you from unnecessary stress. I asked what legal issues. He waved his hand dismissively. Technical things you wouldn't understand. Estate law is complex. But I did understand. Linda had explained everything to me in detail. There were no legal issues. There was only their decision to pretend a document didn't exist because it didn't serve their interests. I told them I'd seen the will, that I knew what Grandma had wanted, that I knew about the properties and the income they'd been collecting. My mother's expression shifted, the mask of concern slipping just slightly. Where did you get that information? She asked, her voice going sharp. Did Frank give you something? He had no right. I told her Grandpa Frank had every right. He was executor of the estate along with my father, and unlike Dad, he'd actually honored Grandma's wishes. My father's face flushed red. Frank is a bitter old man who never forgave me for succeeding where he failed, he said. He's filling your head with lies, because he wants to cause problems. I asked what lies specifically. He couldn't answer. He just shook his head and muttered something about family loyalty. Brandon finally looked up from his phone. You know what your problem is, Elena? You've always thought you were better than us. Going to college, getting your teaching job, living in that sad little apartment like you're proving something. You're not special. You're just ungrateful. The word again. I asked him what exactly I should be grateful for. For being erased from an inheritance? For being asked to fund their lifestyle, while I scraped by? For being sent a fraudulent bill for $250,000? My mother's hand moved then, reaching for her coffee cup. It happened so smoothly I almost didn't register it as intentional. She lifted the cup, tilted it just slightly, and the hot liquid spilled across the table directly onto my forearm. I jerked back, pain shooting through my skin. The kind of burn that doesn't announce itself immediately but builds in waves. The coffee soaked through my sleeve, scalding and relentless. I stood up fast, knocking my chair backward. People turned to look. A server rushed over with napkins. My mother's face arranged itself into shock, her hand covering her mouth. Oh my God, Elena, I'm so sorry. It slipped. Are you okay? But I saw it. I saw the way she'd looked at my father right before. I saw the nod he gave. I saw Brandon raise his phone slightly, angling it toward me, recording my reaction like it was entertainment. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. The server brought ice wrapped in cloth. I pressed it against my arm, the pain sharp and clarifying. My father leaned back in his chair, his voice dropping low so only our table could hear. You're going to drop this legal nonsense, Elena. You're going to take that fabricated will back to whatever lawyer you dug up. And you're going to apologize for wasting everyone's time. And then you're going to pay what you owe us. All of it. $250,000. Because if you don't, we'll make sure everyone knows what kind of daughter you really are. I stared at him, this man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd helped me with algebra homework, who I'd believed loved me in whatever broken way he was capable of. And I realized he'd never loved me. He'd loved the idea of me as an extension of him, as a resource to be managed, as someone who would never question or resist. The moment I stopped playing that role, I stopped being his daughter. I became an obstacle. My mother reached across the table like she was going to touch my hand in comfort, but I pulled away. Her eyes went cold. You have 1 week, she said quietly. 1 week to make this right, or we'll destroy you. We have lawyers too. We have documentation of every dollar you've ever taken from us. We'll show the court you're a liar, that you manipulated a senile old man, that you forged documents. We'll make sure you lose everything. Your case, your reputation, your job. Do you understand? I understood perfectly. They were threatening me because they were scared. People don't threaten people they can beat easily. They threaten people who have power they're afraid of. I picked up my bag, wrapped the ice tighter against my arm, and stood. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I'll see you in court. Then I walked out of that restaurant, through the murmuring crowd of Saturday brunch diners who'd witnessed a family falling apart over expensive coffee and eggs Benedict. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, shaking, the adrenaline finally catching up to me. Then I pulled out my phone, stopped the recording, and sent it directly to Linda. The entire conversation, crystal clear, including the part where they demanded I drop the case and pay them money I didn't owe under threat of retaliation. Linda called me back within 5 minutes. Are you okay? She asked first, and I appreciated that she led with my well-being instead of the legal implications. I told her about the burn. She told me to go to urgent care immediately, to get it documented, to have photographs taken, to get a medical report stating the injury and how it occurred. I did exactly that. The urgent care doctor, a tired woman who looked like she'd seen too many things people shouldn't have to see, cleaned the burn carefully and applied ointment and bandaging. She asked how it happened. I told her the truth. Family dispute. Hot coffee. Deliberately spilled. She didn't ask follow-up questions, just wrote it all down in her report with a kind of weary recognition that made me wonder how many other people she'd treated for injuries inflicted by people who were supposed to love them. When I got home, my arm throbbing despite the pain medication, I found 3 voicemails from my mother, each one escalating in tone. The first was apologetic, almost frantic. Elena, please call me back. I didn't mean for that to happen. It was an accident. We need to talk. The second was frustrated. You're being dramatic. It was just spilled coffee. Stop playing victim and call me back. The third was ice. If you're recording this, know that we're recording too. Anything you try to use against us, we'll use against you tenfold. You're making a mistake you can't take back. But I wasn't making a mistake. For the first time in my life, I was making a choice that was entirely mine, unburdened by guilt or obligation, or the fear of disappointing people who'd been disappointed in me from the start. I forwarded all 3 voicemails to Linda. She called it a pattern of harassment, and said we could add it to the case file. Over the next several days, things moved faster than I expected. Linda filed for a restraining order based on the assault, the threats, and the documented harassment. The judge granted a temporary order, which meant my parents couldn't contact me directly while the case proceeded. Their lawyer filed a motion to dismiss, claiming I was being vindictive and manipulative, that the coffee incident was truly accidental, and I was weaponizing it. But we had the recording. We had the medical report. We had Brandon's social media where he'd posted a vague story that night saying some people play victim for attention with a laughing emoji. We had everything because they'd been so confident I'd never fight back that they hadn't bothered to cover their tracks. Arrogance is its own kind of evidence. Grandpa Frank called me every evening during that week. He never asked how I was doing in that superficial way people do when they don't really want to know. He asked specific questions. Did you eat today? Are you sleeping? Do you need me to come sit with you? I realized those were the questions someone who actually loved you asked. Not what are you going to do for me, but what do you need right now that I can provide? It was such a foreign concept in my family that it almost made me cry the first time he asked. He told me stories about my grandmother during those calls. How she'd built her real estate portfolio from nothing, buying properties when women weren't supposed to be doing business on their own. How she'd navigated a world that told her she was too emotional, too irrational, too female to understand money. How she'd proven them all wrong and done it quietly, without needing applause or validation, just the satisfaction of knowing she'd created something lasting. She wanted you to have those properties because she saw herself in you, Grandpa Frank said. She knew what it was like to be underestimated by the people closest to you. I asked him why my father turned out the way he did. There was a long pause. I think your father loved the idea of success more than the work of earning it, he finally said. And when he married your mother, he found someone who felt the same way. They built their life on appearances, and appearances require funding. When your grandmother wouldn't keep giving them money the way they wanted, they resented her. And when she left you those properties, they saw it as a betrayal, like she'd chosen you over them. But she hadn't chosen me over them. She'd chosen fairness. She'd chosen to give her granddaughter a foundation, a start, the same chance she'd fought for herself. And my parents had stolen that from me, because they couldn't stand the idea that I might have something they couldn't control. The anger I'd been suppressing for weeks finally surfaced. I told Grandpa Frank I didn't understand how people could be that selfish, especially to their own child. He sighed. Some people see their children as investments that are supposed to pay dividends, he said. Your grandmother saw you as a person. That's the difference. Linda called on Thursday with news. The probate court had reviewed the will and the evidence. They'd ruled in favor of the document my grandmother had written, the one that included me. The earlier will my parents had filed was being declared invalid. A full accounting of the Martinez property management income for the past 10 years was being ordered. And the fraudulent debt claim they'd filed against me was being investigated as potential financial elder abuse and extortion. I sat on my apartment floor with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to Linda explain what came next. There would be a hearing. My parents would be required to appear. All financial records would be subpoenaed. The properties would be formally divided according to my grandmother's wishes. And I would be entitled to back payment for my share of the rental income they'd been collecting for a decade. The number she estimated made my head spin. It wasn't life-changing wealth, but it was security. It was choice. It was the future my grandmother had wanted me to have. I asked Linda what my parents would face legally. She was careful in her answer. The court will determine if there was criminal intent in hiding the will, she said. At minimum, they'll face financial penalties and restitution. At maximum, if the prosecutor decides to pursue it, there could be fraud charges. Either way, they won't walk away from this unscathed. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I just felt tired. The kind of tired that lives in your bones and makes you realize how much energy you've spent your whole life trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. That weekend, my Aunt Carol called. She was my father's younger sister, someone I'd always liked but rarely saw because she'd moved to Seattle years ago after some family falling out I'd never fully understood. Her voice was warm but tentative. Elena, I heard what's happening, she said. I want you to know I believe you. I've known what your parents were like for a long time. I just didn't think it was my place to say anything. We talked for over an hour. She told me things I'd never known. How my father had borrowed money from her when she was just starting her business and never paid it back. How my mother had spread rumors about her to other family members when she'd asked for repayment. How they'd slowly frozen her out until she'd decided it was healthier to just keep her distance. I asked her why she was calling now. Because you're doing what I should have done, she said. You're standing up. And I want you to know you're not alone. Even if it feels like it. Even if they try to make you think the whole family is against you. There are people who see the truth. She offered to testify if needed, to share her own experiences with my parents' financial manipulation. I thanked her, feeling something loosen in my chest. Maybe I wasn't the problem. Maybe I'd never been the problem. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. But my parents made one last attempt to contact me before then. They showed up at my school. I was in the middle of teaching a lesson on ecosystems when the office called my classroom. There was a family emergency, they said. My parents were in the lobby. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my voice calm for my students. I told them to work on their worksheets quietly and walked down to the office, my heart pounding. My parents stood near the front desk, both dressed formally like they'd come from something important. My mother's face was carefully composed in concern. My father looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to be there but had been convinced it was necessary. The school secretary, Mrs. Patterson, watched them with clear suspicion. She'd been at Bridlamere for 20 years and had seen every kind of family drama play out in that lobby. When she saw me, her expression softened slightly. Elena, they said it was an emergency. I looked at my parents and felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a vast emptiness where connection used to pretend to exist. I told Mrs. Patterson it wasn't an emergency, that my parents and I were involved in a legal matter, and they weren't supposed to contact me. Her eyebrows rose slightly. She looked at my parents with new understanding. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, she said firmly. This is a school. If you need to speak with your daughter, do it through appropriate legal channels. My mother's mask cracked. We have every right to see our daughter, she said, her voice rising. We're her parents. Mrs. Patterson didn't budge. And she's an employee here, and you're disrupting her workplace. I've asked you to leave. If you don't, I'll call security. My father took my mother's arm. Let's go, Patricia. This isn't working. As they turned to leave, my mother looked back at me. You're going to regret this, she said quietly. When you're older and alone, you'll regret pushing away the only people who ever really loved you. But she was wrong. They'd never really loved me. They'd loved what I could do for them, how I could serve them, how I'd make them look to other people. The moment I stopped being useful, I stopped being worth keeping. That wasn't love. That was transaction. And I was done being currency in someone else's economy. After they left, Mrs. Patterson offered me her office to sit down for a moment. She brought me water and didn't ask questions, just let me breathe until my hands stopped shaking. When I returned to my classroom, my students were still working quietly, and their normalcy, their simple focus on learning about food chains and habitats, felt like medicine. That evening, Grandpa Frank came over with takeout from my favorite Thai place. We ate pad Thai on my apartment floor because my small table only fit one chair, and he told me he was proud of me. Not for fighting, but for refusing to disappear. Your grandmother would be proud too, he said. She spent her whole life making sure she took up space in rooms that didn't want her there. You're doing the same thing. I asked him if it ever got easier. He considered the question carefully. It gets different, he said. You stop needing their approval. You stop measuring yourself by their standards. And one day you wake up and realize you built something they can't touch, something that's entirely yours. That's when you know you won. Not because you destroyed them, but because you freed yourself. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe there was a version of my future where this pain transformed into something useful, something strong. But right then, sitting on my apartment floor with burns still healing on my arm and a court case looming, I just wanted it to be over. The preliminary hearing arrived on a cold morning in late October. The courthouse smelled like old wood and anxiety. Linda met me outside, briefcase in hand, looking professional and unshakable. She'd prepared me for what to expect. My parents would be there with their lawyer. There would be testimony. Documents would be presented. The judge would make determinations about the will's validity and the financial accounting. It would take several hours. I needed to stay calm, answer questions directly, and trust the evidence. We walked into the courtroom together. My parents were already seated at the defendant's table with their attorney, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he specialized in making bad people seem sympathetic. Brandon sat in the gallery behind them. When I entered, none of them looked at me. They stared straight ahead like I was invisible, which felt appropriate. I'd been invisible to them my whole life. Why would today be different? Grandpa Frank sat in the gallery on our side, his presence steady and reassuring. Aunt Carol had flown in from Seattle and sat beside him. A few other people I didn't recognize filled the seats, probably associated with the property management business or the financial audit. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair, and an expression that suggested she'd heard every story and believed none of them until proven otherwise. The proceedings began with Linda presenting our case. She outlined the timeline methodically. My grandmother's will, written 3 months before her death, leaving 40% of her property portfolio to me. The earlier will my parents had filed, dated 5 years prior, which made no mention of me. The suspicious timing of which will was submitted to probate. The decade of rental income collected without my knowledge. The sudden debt claim against me for $250,000. The threatening behavior, the assault, the harassment. My parents' attorney stood and presented their counter-narrative with the kind of smooth confidence that comes from years of spinning uncomfortable truths into palatable fiction. He painted me as a troubled young woman, financially irresponsible, someone who'd repeatedly asked my parents for money over the years and now refused to acknowledge those debts. He suggested my grandmother had been in declining mental health when she wrote the second will, that she'd been unduly influenced, though he carefully avoided naming who might have influenced her since that would open doors he didn't want opened. He brought up my teaching salary, implying it wasn't enough to support my lifestyle, suggesting I'd been living beyond my means and now saw an opportunity to extract money from my family through legal manipulation. He made it sound almost reasonable, the way skilled liars do, taking factual elements and rearranging them until the story served a different master. I watched the judge's face, trying to read whether any of it was landing, but she remained impassive, taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. Linda called her first witness, the attorney who'd helped my grandmother draft her final will. He was an elderly man now, semi-retired, but his memory was sharp and his records were meticulous. He testified that my grandmother had been entirely lucid when she'd come to his office, that she'd known exactly what she wanted to do with her properties, that she'd specifically mentioned wanting to ensure her granddaughter was provided for, because she worried about how my parents managed money. He produced his contemporaneous notes from that meeting, dated and detailed, showing my grandmother's clear intentions. Under cross-examination, my parents' lawyer tried to suggest the attorney had financial incentive to support my claim, perhaps hoping for future business or payment for his testimony. The old lawyer looked at him with something close to pity. "Young man, I'm 78 years old and fully retired," he said. "I'm here because I watched a woman make careful plans for her family's future, and I believe those plans should be honored. I don't need your money or anyone else's." The courtroom was quiet after that, the kind of silence that feels like judgment already forming. Next came the forensic accountant Linda had hired to review the property management finances. She was a woman in her 40s with glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested numbers didn't lie to her even when people did. She walked the court through 10 years of rental income from the properties in my grandmother's portfolio, showed how that income had been deposited into accounts controlled solely by my parents, demonstrated that no distribution had ever been made to reflect my 40% ownership as outlined in my grandmother's will. She calculated, with supporting documentation, that my share of that income over 10 years amounted to approximately $372,000, accounting for property taxes, maintenance costs, and standard management fees. That number hung in the air like a physical thing. My parents shifted in their seats. Their attorney requested a recess to review the accountant's methodology. The judge granted 15 minutes. In the hallway outside, Grandpa Frank put his hand on my shoulder. "You're doing fine," he said. "Just keep breathing." Linda checked her phone, responded to a few messages, then looked at me with something like satisfaction. "Their lawyer is scrambling," she said quietly. "That accounting is airtight. They weren't expecting us to have someone that thorough." I asked what happened next. She smiled slightly. Now we show the threats and the assault. That's when this stops being a civil property dispute and starts looking like a pattern of financial abuse. When we returned to the courtroom, Linda played the recording from the restaurant. The judge listened without expression as my mother's voice filled the room, sweet and concerned at first, then cold and threatening. You have 1 week to make this right, or we'll destroy you. The audio quality was clear, undeniable. Every word hung there, stripped of context or excuse. My father's voice followed, demanding I drop the case and pay them, warning me about what would happen if I didn't comply. Then came the medical report from urgent care, the photographs of the burn on my arm, the doctor's statement noting the injury was consistent with deliberate contact with hot liquid rather than incidental splashing. Linda submitted the server's statement from Riverside Bistro, a young woman who'd witnessed the incident and said it looked intentional to her, that she'd seen the way my mother had tilted the cup with what seemed like purpose. She'd been reluctant to get involved at first, afraid of inserting herself into family business, but Linda had found her and convinced her that truth mattered more than comfort. My parents' attorney objected, calling it hearsay and circumstantial, arguing that a spilled cup of coffee couldn't be proven as assault without video evidence or multiple corroborating witnesses. That's when Linda produced something I hadn't known she had. Brandon's phone had been recording during the restaurant incident, and through a subpoena of his social media accounts, Linda's team had recovered the video he'd posted and then deleted within hours. It showed everything. My mother reaching for the cup, the deliberate tilt, my father's nod of approval, my reaction, and worst of all, Brandon laughing as he filmed my pain. The judge watched the video twice. Then she looked at my parents with an expression that needed no words. Their attorney requested another recess. The judge denied it. We're going to finish this today, she said, her voice carrying weight that hadn't been there before. I've seen enough delays and enough evidence. Let's proceed. My parents' lawyer called my father to testify, perhaps hoping he could salvage something through personal appeal. The loving father wronged by an ungrateful daughter. My father took the stand and was sworn in. He looked smaller somehow, older, like the weight of exposure was physically pressing him down. Their attorney led him through a practiced narrative about how hard he'd worked to provide for his family, how much he'd sacrificed, how painful it was to be accused of wrongdoing by his own daughter. He talked about the financial help he'd given me over the years, conveniently omitting that I'd actually been the one sending money to them. He claimed the coffee spill was a genuine accident, that my mother had been distraught afterward, that they only wanted what was fair. When Linda stood to cross-examine, she didn't raise her voice or show anger. She simply asked questions. Mr. Martinez, when did you first learn about your mother's final will? The one leaving 40% of her properties to Elena? My father hesitated. I'm not sure exactly when. Linda pulled out a document. According to the estate attorney's records, he sent you a copy 3 days after your mother's death. Do you recall receiving that? My father shifted. I may have. There were a lot of documents at that time. Linda continued. And yet you filed a different will with probate, one that made no mention of your daughter's inheritance. Can you explain why? My father's jaw tightened. We believed the earlier will was more valid. It reflected our mother's wishes when she was healthier. Linda tilted her head slightly. But you had correspondence from the attorney confirming she was of sound mind when she wrote the later will. You had his testimony that she specifically wanted Elena provided for. Why would you disregard that? My father didn't have a good answer. He stumbled through something about family dynamics and complex relationships, about how they'd thought it was better to keep things simple. Linda let his weak explanation hang there for a moment before moving on. Mr. Martinez, how much rental income have the properties in your mother's portfolio generated over the past 10 years? He claimed he didn't know off the top of his head. Linda showed him the accounting report. $3.7 million in gross rental income. Does that sound accurate? He admitted it might be. And during those 10 years, did you ever contact Elena to inform her she owned 40% of those properties? No, because we didn't believe that will was valid. But you never challenged it in court. You simply ignored it. Is that correct? My father's attorney objected, but the judge overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Martinez. My father looked cornered. We handled things the way we thought was best for the family. Linda nodded slowly. Best for which members of the family, exactly? The cross-examination continued for another 20 minutes, each question tightening the noose of inconsistency around my father's testimony. He contradicted himself multiple times, couldn't explain why they'd threaten me if they truly believed they were in the right, couldn't justify the debt claim that had no supporting documentation. By the time Linda finished, my father looked defeated, and their attorney looked like he regretted taking this case. My mother didn't testify. Their lawyer made the strategic decision to keep her off the stand, probably realizing she'd be even more damaging to their case than my father had been. Instead, they called Brandon as a character witness, perhaps hoping his testimony about our family dynamics would paint me as the problem child, the troublemaker who'd always been difficult. Brandon took the stand wearing a suit that looked borrowed, too big in the shoulders, and spoke about how I'd always been distant from the family, how I'd moved out and acted like I was better than them, how I'd suddenly gotten vindictive when I didn't get my way. Linda's cross-examination was brief. Mr. Martinez, you recorded your sister being burned with hot coffee at that restaurant, didn't you? Brandon tried to deny it at first, but Linda showed him his own deleted social media post. He admitted he'd filmed it. And you laughed while filming. Is that correct? He claimed it was a nervous laugh, that he didn't think it was serious. Linda showed the video again, played the audio of his laughter, clear and mocking. Then she asked him how much money our parents had given him over the past 10 years. He didn't want to answer. The judge told him he had to. Brandon admitted our parents had been supporting him financially, paying his rent, his car, his credit cards, for the entire decade since he'd dropped out of college. Linda asked how much total. He estimated maybe $100,000, trying to sound casual about it. Linda showed him bank record she'd subpoenaed. The actual number was closer to $400,000. Brandon went pale. He hadn't realized anyone was tracking that, hadn't considered that his lifestyle was evidence of exactly who our parents chose to invest in, and who they chose to exploit. After Brandon stepped down, the judge called for final arguments. My parents' attorney tried to reframe everything as a family disagreement blown out of proportion, suggested mediation, asked for the court to consider the emotional complexity of these situations. He made it sound like everyone was a victim of circumstance, that maybe the fair thing was to just split everything evenly and move forward. Linda stood and methodically dismantled that argument. This isn't a family disagreement, Your Honor. This is fraud, she said. The defendants knowingly suppressed a valid will, collected income from properties they knew they didn't fully own, and when confronted with evidence of their actions, they threatened and assaulted the rightful beneficiary. They fabricated a debt to intimidate her into silence. They showed up at her workplace to harass her despite a restraining order. This is a pattern of deliberate financial abuse, and it needs to be addressed as such, not mediated away. The judge took a 15-minute recess to review her notes and consider the evidence. Those 15 minutes felt like hours. I sat in the hallway with Grandpa Frank, not talking, just existing in the space between past and future. Aunt Carol bought me a coffee from the courthouse cafe, terrible bitter coffee that tasted like desperation, but I drank it anyway because I needed something to do with my hands. Linda paced slowly, her mind clearly working through contingencies, preparing for whatever came next. When we were called back in, the courtroom felt different, heavier with the weight of impending judgment. The judge sat behind her bench and looked at everyone in the room before speaking. I've reviewed the evidence presented today, she began, and I'm prepared to make several rulings. First, regarding the validity of the will in question. The evidence overwhelmingly supports that Mrs. Martinez was of sound mind when she executed her final will 3 months before her death. The testimony of her attorney, the contemporaneous documentation, and the clear expression of her wishes leave no doubt in my mind that this document represents her true intentions. Therefore, I'm ruling that the will leaving 40% of the property portfolio to Elena Martinez is valid and should have been honored upon Mrs. Martinez's death 10 years ago. The earlier will filed by Robert and Patricia Martinez is hereby declared invalid and superseded. My parents sat very still, like movement might shatter whatever composure they had left. The judge continued. Regarding the financial accounting, I'm ordering that Elena Martinez receive her rightful share of all rental income generated from these properties over the past 10 years, minus reasonable expenses, as calculated by the forensic accountant. That amount is $372,000, to be paid within 90 days. Additionally, I'm awarding Elena Martinez ownership of her 40% share of the properties as outlined in her grandmother's will, effective immediately. A formal property transfer will be executed within 30 days. Regarding the fraudulent debt claim filed by Robert and Patricia Martinez, I'm dismissing it with prejudice and ordering them to pay Elena Martinez's legal fees in defending against it. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential fraud and extortion charges. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers on keys. The judge wasn't finished. Regarding the assault documented at Riverside Bistro, I'm extending the restraining order indefinitely. Robert and Patricia Martinez are prohibited from contacting Elena Martinez directly or indirectly, from coming within 500 feet of her residence or workplace, and from making any public statements about her or this case. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. Finally, I want to say something off the record, though it will be part of the transcript. The judge looked directly at my parents. I've been on this bench for 19 years, and I've seen many families destroy themselves over money and pride. But what I've seen here today goes beyond typical estate disputes. What you did to your daughter was cruel. You had a legal obligation to honor your mother's wishes, and you ignored it. You had a moral obligation to treat your child with honesty and respect, and you violated it. You chose greed over integrity, and now you'll face the consequences of that choice. She turned to me. Ms. Martinez, I hope you use your inheritance the way your grandmother intended, to build something good and lasting. You've shown remarkable courage in standing up for yourself, and that courage deserves to be rewarded. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sound like a door closing on one part of my life and opening on another. My parents stood and left quickly, their attorney gathering papers with visible frustration. Brandon followed them without looking back. I watched them go, these people who'd raised me and betrayed me, and felt nothing but relief that it was over. Grandpa Frank hugged me carefully, mindful of my still healing arm. Your grandmother would be so proud, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wish she could have seen this. I told him I thought maybe she had, in whatever way the dead watched over the living. Aunt Carol congratulated Linda on the victory. The two of them already talking about the next steps, the property transfers, the payment timeline, the practical details that would transform legal words into real change. Linda turned to me and smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her through this entire process. You did it, she said simply. You won. But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving. It felt like finally being able to breathe after holding my breath for 30 years. That night, I went back to my small apartment and sat in the quiet. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call friends or open champagne, or do any of the things people do when they win court cases. I just sat with the weight of what had happened, letting it settle into my bones, acknowledging that I'd lost my family but gained something more valuable, myself. The version of me that didn't apologize for existing, that didn't shrink to make other people comfortable, that knew her own worth regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. Over the following weeks, the practical aftermath unfolded in lawyers' offices and bank conferences. The properties were formally transferred into my name, 40% ownership in 8 residential units scattered across Portland's evolving neighborhoods. Some needed work, some were well-maintained, all represented years of my grandmother's careful investment and planning. I met with property managers, reviewed tenant agreements, learned the business I was now part owner of. The rental income started flowing into an account set up specifically for this purpose. Each deposit felt surreal, money that should have been mine all along now finally arriving like a long-delayed apology from the universe. I didn't quit my teaching job. I loved my students, loved the work, loved knowing I was contributing something meaningful beyond money and property. But I did finally have breathing room, the ability to save properly, to plan for a future that felt secure instead of precarious. My parents made one final attempt to contact me through a letter forwarded by their attorney. It was my mother's handwriting, pages of justification and blame, explaining how I'd misunderstood everything, how they'd only been trying to protect me from the burden of property management, how I'd destroyed the family over greed and stubbornness. She never apologized. She never acknowledged what they'd actually done. The letter was just more of what I'd gotten my entire life, a rewriting of reality where they were always the victims, and I was always the problem. I read it once, then filed it away with all the other documents from the case. Not because I wanted to keep revisiting it, but because I'd learned the value of documentation, of having proof when people tried to gaslight you into doubting your own memory. Then I wrote one letter back, short and final. I forgive you for my own peace, not because you deserve it. But I will never forget, and I will never allow you back into my life. Consider this goodbye. I sent it through my attorney and asked that all future communication cease. The months that followed felt like learning to walk in a body I'd always had but never fully inhabited. Spring came to Portland with its usual gentle insistence. Cherry blossoms lining the streets near my apartment, the kind of beauty that felt almost too generous after the winter I'd survived. I started running in the mornings before school, something I'd never made time for when every moment was spent either working or worrying about money. Now I ran through the quiet streets watching the city wake up, and the rhythm of my feet on pavement felt like proof that I existed outside of anyone else's narrative about me. David, my partner of 3 years, had been steady through everything. He was a software engineer, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of person who showed love through action rather than declaration. During the worst of the court proceedings, he'd simply shown up. He'd brought groceries when I forgot to eat. He'd sat with me through panic attacks at 3 in the morning when the weight of confronting my family felt impossible. He never told me what to do or how to feel. He just made space for whatever I needed to be. One evening in late April, we were cooking dinner together in my small kitchen when he asked if I'd thought about what came next. I told him I wasn't sure what he meant. With the properties, he clarified, stirring pasta while I chopped vegetables. With the money. With your life now that you have choices you didn't have before. I admitted I'd been afraid to think too far ahead. Like planning for a future might jinx the fragile stability I'd finally found. He nodded, understanding in the way he always seemed to. But maybe that's exactly why you should think about it, he said. Because you get to now. That conversation planted something that grew slowly over the following weeks. I started imagining possibilities instead of just surviving circumstances. I met with a financial advisor Aunt Carol recommended, a woman who specialized in helping people manage unexpected inheritances and windfalls. She helped me understand the properties not just as assets but as tools, ways to build the kind of security my grandmother had envisioned for me. We created investment strategies, discussed long-term planning, talked about the difference between maintaining wealth and growing it responsibly. I also started therapy. Not because I was broken, but because carrying the weight of family betrayal alone felt too heavy, and I'd learned that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom. My therapist was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, probably no relation to David despite the shared surname, who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse. She helped me untangle the complex knot of love and manipulation that had defined my relationship with my parents, helped me see that grief for what could have been was legitimate even when I didn't regret my choices. In one session, Dr. Chin asked me what I'd lost and what I'd gained. I thought about it carefully. I'd lost the fantasy of a loving family, the hope that someday my parents would see me and value me the way I'd always wanted. I'd lost the version of myself that bent and accommodated and disappeared to keep peace. I'd lost the belief that being quiet and good would eventually earn me the love I deserved. But I'd gained the properties and the money, yes, but more than that. I'd gained self-respect. I'd gained the knowledge that I could stand up for myself and survive the consequences. I'd gained freedom from the constant anxiety of trying to please people who would never be satisfied. I'd gained my voice. Dr. Chin nodded slowly. Sometimes the price of freedom is the death of illusion, she said. You're mourning people who never really existed, the parents you needed them to be versus who they actually were. That's a profound loss. But you're also becoming someone your grandmother clearly believed you could be. Someone who wouldn't be controlled or diminished. That's a profound gain. I left that session feeling lighter, like she'd given me permission to hold both truths simultaneously, the sadness and the strength, the grief and the growth. At school, My students noticed something had changed even if they couldn't articulate what. I was more present with them, more patient, more able to find joy in their small victories and growth. Teaching had always mattered to me, but now it felt like a choice I was making rather than the only option available. One of my students, a girl named Maya who reminded me achingly of my younger self, stayed after class one day and asked if I was okay. I was surprised by the question. "Why do you ask?" I said gently. She shrugged, suddenly shy. "You seem different. Like you're not scared anymore." Children see things adults learn to pretend aren't visible. I told Maya I was okay, better than okay actually, and that sometimes people go through hard things that make them stronger. She nodded seriously, then said something that stayed with me. "My mom says brave people aren't the ones who aren't scared. They're the ones who do the right thing even when they're terrified." I asked her if her mom was a wise person. Maya grinned. "Sometimes. When she's not yelling at us to clean our rooms." I laughed, and it felt good, the kind of genuine laughter that had been rare for too long. In June, Grandpa Frank invited me to his cottage for dinner. It was the first time I'd been back since the night he'd shown me my grandmother's will, the night everything had started shifting. The garden he maintained with such care was in full bloom, roses and lavender and something purple I couldn't name filling the air with sweetness. We ate salmon he'd grilled and salad from his garden. And he told me stories about my grandmother I'd never heard. How she'd negotiated her first property purchase with nothing but determination and a handshake. How she'd dealt with difficult tenants by being fair but firm. How she'd built her legacy one careful decision at a time. After dinner, we sat on his porch watching the light fade from the sky, that particular Pacific Northwest summer evening that stretches on forever in shades of gold and amber. Grandpa Frank was quiet for a long time, just rocking slowly in his chair. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." I felt my stomach tighten, old instincts expecting bad news. He must have seen my expression because he smiled slightly. "Nothing terrible. Just something I've been thinking about." He told me he was 91 years old, that he'd lived a good long life but he was getting tired. He'd been thinking about his own estate planning, about what happened after he was gone. He owned his cottage outright, had some savings, nothing compared to what my grandmother had built but enough to matter. He wanted me to know that he was leaving everything to me. Not because I needed it, he clarified, but because I'd earned it by being the kind of person his daughter, my grandmother, had hoped I'd become. Someone who stood up for what was right even when it cost everything. I started to protest, to say he should leave it to whoever he wanted, that I didn't need anything more from him. He held up his hand to stop me. "Elena, let me finish. I'm not telling you this to make you uncomfortable or to put pressure on you. I'm telling you because I want you to know you're valued, that your place in this family, the real family that matters, is secure. You're not the problem child your parents tried to make you believe you were. You're the best of us." I cried then. Not sad tears but the kind that come when someone sees you clearly and loves what they see. Grandpa Frank wasn't uncomfortable with my emotion. He just handed me his handkerchief, worn soft from years of use, and let me cry until I was finished. When I could speak again, I told him he'd saved me. He shook his head. "No honey, I just reminded you of what your grandmother already taught you. You saved yourself." By August, I'd settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. The properties were running smoothly with professional management I'd hired to handle day-to-day operations. I reviewed monthly reports, made decisions about necessary repairs and improvements, learned the business from people who'd been doing it for decades. The income was steady and significant, transforming my financial reality from precarious to secure. I was still teaching, still loved it, but I'd been able to reduce some of my after-school tutoring commitments that I'd only taken for extra money, giving myself actual free time for the first time in years. David and I started talking seriously about our future. He'd been patient, never pushing, but now he asked questions that assumed a shared tomorrow. What kind of house would you want someday? Do you think about having kids? What does the life you want actually look like? We talked about these things over weekend hikes and lazy Sunday mornings, building a vision together that felt collaborative rather than prescribed. In September, we started looking at houses, nothing too big or showy, just something with enough space to grow into, maybe a yard for the dog we both wanted eventually. I also reached out to other family members I'd lost touch with over the years, people like Aunt Carol who'd been frozen out by my parents' version of family loyalty. I discovered I had cousins I barely knew, second cousins and family friends who'd cared about my grandmother, and wondered what had happened to me. We had dinners and coffee meetings, slowly rebuilding connections that my parents had severed. These people had their own stories about my parents' behavior, their own experiences with being excluded or manipulated, and hearing those stories helped me understand I'd never been the problem. The pattern had always been there. I'd just been the latest victim of it, until I'd decided to be the last. One of those cousins, Marcus, was a real estate developer who gave me advice about the properties I'd inherited. He suggested some strategic improvements that would increase their value, connected me with reliable contractors, taught me things about property management my grandmother probably would have taught me herself if she'd had the chance. Through Marcus, I met other people in Portland's real estate community, slowly building a network that felt supportive rather than exploitative. I was learning to trust again, cautiously, but learning nonetheless. In October, almost a year after the coffee incident that had catalyzed everything, I received a message through my attorney. My mother had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and my father wanted to know if I'd be willing to visit, to reconcile, to let them back into my life before it was too late. The message was phrased carefully, designed to pull at any remaining threads of guilt or obligation. The subtext was clear. Good daughters forgive. Good daughters put aside their hurt when parents are suffering. Good daughters sacrifice their boundaries for family peace. I sat with that message for 3 days, reading it multiple times, feeling the old familiar pull of responsibility and duty. Dr. Chun and I talked through it in therapy. She didn't tell me what to do. She just asked questions. What do you think they want from you? What do you hope would happen if you went? What would it cost you emotionally? What would you regret more, going or not going? I worked through each question honestly. They wanted absolution without apology. They wanted me to pretend the past year hadn't happened. To resume my role as the family member who absorbed hurt without complaint. If I went, I hoped for some acknowledgement of wrongdoing, some genuine remorse, but I knew I wouldn't get it. They'd proven repeatedly who they were. Going would cost me the peace I'd fought so hard to build. It would reopen wounds that were finally starting to scar over. It would tell them that boundaries were negotiable if they just pushed hard enough. And what would I regret more? I realized I'd regret going, regret allowing them one more opportunity to make me feel small and wrong and never enough. I wouldn't regret protecting myself. I wouldn't regret honoring the choice I'd already made to prioritize my own well-being over their comfort. I sent a response through my attorney, brief and final. I'm sorry for your illness, but I'm not able to resume contact. I wish you peace, but I can't provide it at the cost of my own. Please respect the boundaries I've established. My mother's illness was real and serious, and I felt genuine sadness about that. But her suffering didn't erase what she'd done, didn't obligate me to forgive without apology, didn't make me responsible for her emotional needs at the expense of my own healing. Compassion didn't require self-destruction. I could wish her well from a distance while still protecting myself from further harm. November brought unexpected news. The district attorney's office had completed their investigation into my parents' financial activities and decided to file charges. Not major felony charges, but significant misdemeanors related to fraudulent debt collection and suppression of estate documents. Their attorney reached out to Linda asking if I'd be willing to provide victim impact testimony if the case went to trial. I thought about it carefully. Part of me wanted nothing more to do with them, wanted to let the legal system handle it and move on with my life. But another part of me, the part that remembered sitting in that restaurant with burns on my arm and watching them smile, that part wanted to speak. I told Linda I'd testify if needed. She warned me it would be difficult, that I'd be cross-examined, that my parents' attorney would try to make me look vindictive or mercenary. I told her I understood, but I wanted other people who might be in similar situations to see that fighting back was possible, that family loyalty didn't mean accepting abuse, that standing up for yourself had consequences, but so did staying silent. Linda smiled at that. You've come a long way from the woman who first walked into my office, she said. That woman was scared but determined. You're just determined now. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for January, But in December, my parents' attorney approached Linda about a plea deal. They'd admit to the charges, pay fines and restitution, accept probation, if I agreed not to testify, and to sign a statement saying I considered the matter resolved. Linda brought me the offer and waited while I processed it. This was them trying to control the narrative one last time, trying to keep me from speaking publicly about what they'd done. But it was also an admission of guilt, a legal acknowledgement that I'd been telling the truth all along. I asked Linda what she recommended. She said it was entirely my decision, that both paths had merit. If I testified, I'd get my day in court, my voice on record. If I accepted the plea, I'd get closure faster and avoid the stress of a trial. I thought about my grandmother, about the way she'd fought her battles strategically rather than emotionally. I thought about what would actually serve my healing versus what would just feel satisfying in the moment. I told Linda I'd accept the plea on one condition. The admission of guilt had to be public record, and they had to agree to never contact me again, ever, under any circumstances, with violation resulting in automatic criminal penalties. Linda negotiated those terms. My parents agreed. In late December, they stood in court and formally admitted to fraudulent debt collection and improper handling of estate documents. The judge sentenced them to probation, community service, and ordered them to pay additional restitution beyond what they'd already paid me. The case was closed. I didn't attend the hearing. I didn't need to watch them admit what I already knew was true. I was teaching that day, helping my students understand fractions and preparing them for their winter break, choosing to spend my energy on something constructive rather than watching the final dissolution of a family that had never really functioned. That Christmas was the first one I spent without any contact with my parents or Brandon. David and I flew to Seattle to spend it with Aunt Carol and her family. We ate too much food, played board games with my cousin's kids, watched them open presents with that particular joy children have before the world teaches them to be cynical. On Christmas Eve, Aunt Carol pulled me aside and handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a necklace that had belonged to my grandmother, a simple silver chain with a small pendant shaped like a key. "Your grandmother wore this every day," Aunt Carol said. She told me once that it reminded her that she held the keys to her own life, that no one could lock her into a role or identity she didn't choose. "She'd want you to have it now." I put it on and felt the weight of it against my chest, tangible and grounding. That night, lying in the guest room with David asleep beside me, I touched the necklace and thought about my grandmother, about the legacy she'd left that was so much more than money or property. She'd left me a blueprint for how to be strong without being hard, how to fight without losing yourself, how to survive betrayal without becoming bitter. The new year arrived with the kind of quiet hope that comes after surviving something you weren't sure you'd survive. In January, David and I found a house in the Selwood neighborhood, not far from Grandpa Frank, with 3 bedrooms and a yard that needed work but had good bones. We made an offer that was accepted, started planning the renovations we wanted, talking about paint colors and furniture, and all the small domestic details that make a house feel like home. The down payment came from my inheritance, money my grandmother had earned through hard work and wanted me to use for exactly this purpose, building a life. We moved in February on a rainy Saturday with help from friends and Aunt Carol's family. Grandpa Frank came over and walked through each room slowly, nodding his approval. "This is good," he said finally. "This is what she wanted for you. Roots and wings. Somewhere to build from and the freedom to become whoever you want to be." That night, after everyone had left and the house was full of boxes, but also full of possibility, David and I sat on the floor of our empty living room and just looked at each other. We'd done it. We'd built something that was entirely ours. Spring came again, my second spring of freedom, and everything felt different. The cherry blossoms returned, but this time I could appreciate them without the weight of impending confrontation or legal battles. I planted a garden in our backyard, vegetables and flowers mixed together in a way my grandmother would have approved of, practical and beautiful at the same time. I was still teaching, still loved my job, but I'd also started talking with Marcus about potentially investing in a small development project, using some of my resources to create affordable housing in Portland. It felt like a way to honor my grandmother's legacy while building my own. In April, Grandpa Frank's health started declining more rapidly. Nothing sudden, just the gradual wearing down of a body that had lived fully for more than 9 decades. I visited him several times a week, sitting with him in his cottage, listening to his stories, making sure he wasn't alone. He'd refused to move into assisted living, wanted to die in the home he'd shared with my grandmother, and I promised him he could. David and I took turns staying overnight when he needed it, making sure someone was always there. One evening in early May, sitting on his porch in the fading light, Grandpa Frank told me he was ready to go. Not in a sad way, just matter of fact. "I've had a good life," he said. "I've seen my grandchildren grow up strong. I kept my promise to your grandmother. I'm tired, Elena. I'm ready to rest." I held his hand. This man who'd saved me when he didn't have to, who'd honored truth when it would have been easier to stay silent, who'd taught me that real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself. I told him I loved him. I told him thank you. I told him he could rest now, that I'd be okay, that he'd given me everything I needed to keep going. He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, which felt like the gift he'd always been to everyone who loved him. The funeral was small, just family and close friends. The real family who showed up and cared and chose each other beyond blood obligation. We buried him next to my grandmother in a cemetery overlooking the city they'd both loved. I spoke at the service, told stories about his kindness and his courage, about how he'd taught me that integrity wasn't about being perfect, but about doing the right thing even when it cost you something. Afterward, at the gathering at Aunt Carol's house, people shared their own stories about Grandpa Frank. I learned things I hadn't known, small acts of generosity he'd performed without fanfare, people he'd helped over the years without ever seeking credit or recognition. He'd been the best kind of person, the kind who made the world better through consistent small choices rather than grand gestures. I wanted to be like that. I wanted to build that kind of legacy. In the weeks after his death, I helped Aunt Carol settle his estate. True to his word, he'd left everything to me: the cottage, his modest savings, his car, his collection of vinyl records and books, and the accumulated treasures of a long life. I kept what mattered emotionally and sold or donated the rest. The cottage I decided to keep as a rental property, continuing my grandmother's legacy. I couldn't live there myself, too many memories, but I liked knowing it would continue sheltering people, that the space they created together would go on serving a purpose. By summer, life had settled into something that felt remarkably normal, which was its own kind of miracle after years of chaos. David and I hosted barbecues in our backyard. I taught summer school for students who needed extra support. We adopted a dog from the local shelter, a mutt named Charlie who'd been overlooked because he wasn't a puppy anymore and had some scars from whatever life he'd lived before. He fit right in with 2 people who understood something about surviving difficult histories and building new futures. I still thought about my parents sometimes, wondered if they ever felt regret or if they'd simply rewritten the story in their minds until they were the victims of my cruelty. I'd heard through extended family that my mother's illness had progressed, that Brandon was living with them full-time now, taking care of them. I felt sadness about that, the kind of ambient sadness you feel for suffering in the world, even when it's not your responsibility to fix it. But I didn't feel guilty. I'd offered them chances to do better, to be better, and they'd chosen pride and greed over relationship. Those were their choices, not mine, and I'd stopped carrying their consequences. In August, almost 2 years after everything started, I was working in the garden on a Saturday morning when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, which I almost never answered anymore, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice introduced herself as a social worker from the hospital. She was calling about my mother, who'd been admitted, and was asking for me. The woman's tone was professional but kind. She wanted me to know I wasn't obligated to come, that she understood family situations were complicated, but her job required her to pass along the message. I thanked her for calling and told her I wouldn't be coming. There was a pause. The social worker said she understood, asked if there was anyone else who should be contacted. I gave her Aunt Carol's information, knowing Carol would do what she felt was right without expecting me to compromise my boundaries. After I hung up, I stood in my garden with dirt under my fingernails and Charlie lying in the sun nearby, and I felt clear. Not cruel, not vindictive, just clear. Some bridges burn beyond repair, and standing in the ashes trying to rebuild them doesn't honor anyone. My mother died 2 weeks later. I learned about it from Aunt Carol, who'd been with her at the end along with Brandon. Carol told me my mother had asked for me multiple times, had seemed confused about why I wouldn't come, had died without understanding or at least without acknowledging what she'd done to deserve my absence. Carol didn't judge me for staying away. She just told me the facts and asked if I needed anything. I told her I was okay, that I'd grieve in my own way, and I did. I grieved for the mother I'd needed and never had. I grieved for the childhood version of myself who tried so hard to be good enough to earn love that was never going to be freely given. I grieved for the wasted years and the stolen money and the opportunities my parents' selfishness had cost me. But I didn't grieve for the relationship we'd had at the end, because there was nothing there worth mourning. They'd destroyed it long before I'd walked away. I just finally acknowledged what they'd already done. I didn't go to the funeral. David offered to go with me if I wanted, to stand beside me through it, but I declined. Brandon sent one text. Mom's funeral is Thursday. You should be here. I didn't respond. Aunt Carol went and represented the family members who'd been excluded and diminished by my parents over the years. She sent me photos afterward of the flowers, of my grandmother's grave nearby, of the beautiful autumn day it had been. That felt like enough. In the months that followed, I discovered that grief and relief could coexist, that I could be sad about how things had ended while also feeling freed by the finality of it. My mother's death meant I'd never get the apology I'd wanted, never hear her take responsibility, never experience the reconciliation some part of me had still foolishly hoped might be possible. But it also meant I could stop waiting for those things, could stop holding space for people who would never fill it the way I needed. David and I got married that December, a small ceremony in our backyard with Aunt Carol officiating and 40 guests who actually loved us. No family drama, no people attending out of obligation, just chosen family and friends celebrating something genuine. I wore my grandmother's necklace and carried flowers from our garden. During our vows, I promised David I'd keep showing up as my fullest self, keep choosing honesty over comfort, keep building the kind of partnership my grandparents had modeled. He promised the same. It felt like the truest thing I'd ever done. Now it's been 3 years since that morning at Riverside Bistro when coffee burned my arm, and my parents demanded money they weren't owed. 3 years since Grandpa Frank stood up with his briefcase full of truth and changed everything. I'm 33 years old. I own property worth over $2 million. I have a career I love and a marriage that feels like partnership rather than performance. I have a dog in a garden and a house that's actually mine. I have therapy appointments and book club meetings and weekend hikes and all the ordinary components of a life I built from the ruins of the one I was given. People sometimes ask if I regret how things turned out, if I wish I'd tried harder to maintain family relationships, if the money and property were worth losing my parents and brother. The question always surprises me because it assumes I lost something valuable. I didn't lose a family. I escaped people who saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be loved. What I gained, my freedom, my self-respect, my future, was worth infinitely more than what I left behind. My grandmother understood something essential that she tried to teach me through her will and her example. Your value doesn't come from how much you sacrifice or how small you make yourself or how much you tolerate in the name of keeping peace. Your value is inherent. And anyone who can't see that, who tries to convince you otherwise, who punishes you for standing up for yourself, doesn't deserve access to your life. That lesson took me 30 years to learn, but once I learned it, everything changed. So if you're reading this or hearing this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you're the one being erased or exploited or gaslit by people who claim to love you, if you're the one wondering if you're crazy for feeling hurt by treatment others say you should accept, if you're the one carrying guilt for boundaries you know you need to set, I want you to know something. You're not wrong. Your feelings are valid. And choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. It's the first step toward the life you deserve. The life people who actually love you want you to have. It won't be easy. Standing up costs something. You might lose people you thought you needed. You might face judgment from people who don't understand or who benefit from your silence. You might lie awake some nights wondering if you made the right choice. But on the other side of that fear is freedom. On the other side is the version of yourself you were always meant to be before other people's expectations tried to reshape you into something more manageable. I'm not special. I'm not uniquely strong or brave or resilient. I was just someone who got tired of being small, who had help at the right moment, who learned that documentation and truth were more powerful than manipulation and lies. If I could do it, you can too. And if you need permission to fight for yourself, to claim what's yours, to walk away from people who hurt you regardless of biology or history, consider this your permission. You don't owe anyone access to your life at the cost of your peace. You never did. 3 years later, I'm still healing. Some wounds don't close completely. But I'm also thriving in ways my younger self couldn't have imagined. And every day I wake up in a house I chose, next to a partner who sees and values me, doing work that matters, living a life my grandmother fought to make possible. I know I made the right choice. Not the easy one, but the right one. And that's enough. That's everything. The years continued to unfold in ways that felt both ordinary and miraculous. By the time I turned 35, the properties my grandmother had left me had appreciated significantly in value as Portland's real estate market continued its upward trajectory. What had been worth roughly $2 million when I'd first gained control was now valued closer to $3.5 million. I'd refinanced strategically, used some of the equity to invest in Marcus's affordable housing development project, and watched that investment not only generate returns but create actual good in the world. Housing for families who needed it. The development was a modest complex in East Portland, 24 units designed for working families making too much for subsidized housing, but not enough for market-rate apartments. We'd kept the rents intentionally affordable, built community spaces into the design, hired a property manager who actually cared about the residents rather than just collecting payments. On the day we cut the ribbon and the first families moved in, I stood back and watched children run through the courtyard we'd landscaped. Watched parents who'd been living in cramped or unstable situations unpack boxes into apartments with good light and functioning appliances. And I felt my grandmother's presence so strongly it almost knocked me over. This was what wealth was supposed to do. Not hoard itself, not build walls between people, not get weaponized against family members who dared to want their fair share. It was supposed to flow and create and lift and expand possibility beyond yourself. My grandmother had understood that instinctively. She'd built her portfolio not just to have money but to have options, to create security that could be shared, to leave something that would keep maturing after she was gone. I was trying to do the same, to be a good steward of what she'd entrusted to me. Teaching continued to ground me in ways I hadn't expected. Every September brought a new group of 10-year-olds. Each one carrying their own complicated family situations, their own struggles and strengths and stories. I saw myself in so many of them, the quiet ones especially, the ones who tried to be invisible, who'd learned that taking up space meant inviting criticism or punishment. I made sure those kids knew I saw them, that their presence mattered, that being quiet didn't mean they had nothing important to say. One student in particular, a girl named Jasmine, reminded me painfully of my younger self. She was brilliant with numbers, could solve complex problems in her head that other kids needed calculators for, but she never raised her hand, never volunteered answers, always shrank when attention turned her direction. Her home life was complicated, a single mother working multiple jobs, an older brother who dropped out of school, financial stress that leaked into every aspect of their lives. I recognized the signs because I'd lived them. The worn clothes rewashed until they were soft and faded. The lunch packed with whatever was cheapest rather than what she might actually want. The tiredness that came from adult worries in a child's body. I started working with Jasmine during lunch periods, just the two of us, giving her space to show what she knew without the pressure of performing for peers. She blossomed in those sessions, asked questions, made connections, demonstrated the kind of mathematical intuition that couldn't really be taught, only nurtured. I talked to her mother about enrichment programs, helped her apply for scholarships, wrote recommendations that emphasized not just Jasmine's intelligence but her resilience, her quiet determination, her potential that just needed opportunity to fully manifest. When Jasmine got accepted to a prestigious summer math program with full funding, her mother called me crying. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You gave her something I couldn't." I told her she was wrong. That she'd given Jasmine everything that mattered, the love and support and foundation. I'd just opened a door that was always going to open for a kid that talented. She just needed someone to show her where the door was. But I understood her gratitude because I remembered what it felt like when Grandpa Frank had done the same for me, had shown me there was a path forward I hadn't been able to see on my own. David and I had been trying to have a baby for almost a year without success. We'd gone through the initial testing, the awkward conversations with specialists, the realization that biology doesn't care about your readiness or your stable income or your good intentions. The doctors said there was no clear reason we couldn't conceive, which somehow made it more frustrating than if there had been an obvious problem to solve. We were in that liminal space of maybe it will happen naturally, maybe you need intervention, maybe you should start thinking about alternatives. The miscarriage came in the spring of my 36th year, 12 weeks along, just past the point where we'd started telling close friends and family, just past the point where I'd let myself imagine a future with this specific child. I woke up bleeding one morning and knew immediately what was happening. David drove me to the hospital, held my hand through the confirmation ultrasound that showed what we already knew, the absence of a heartbeat that had been there just 2 weeks earlier at our last checkup. The doctor was kind but clinical, explaining the options, the procedures, the physical recovery timeline. No one mentioned the emotional recovery, because that timeline was undefined and personal, and impossible to predict. I took a week off from school, the first time I'd taken sick leave in years. We told people it was a medical issue, which was true enough without inviting the kind of sympathy that felt suffocating. Aunt Carol came and sat with me, didn't try to fill the silence with platitudes or promises that it would happen again when the time was right. She just sat and occasionally squeezed my hand and brought me tea, and let me exist in the grief without trying to rush me through it to some more comfortable emotional state. Dr. Chen helped me process the loss in therapy, helped me separate the biological fact of miscarriage from the stories I was tempting to tell myself about failure or inadequacy. She reminded me that wanting something doesn't guarantee getting it, that doing everything right doesn't insulate you from loss, that grief for a potential future is legitimate even when others might not understand it. I cried in her office in ways I hadn't let myself cry at home, where I was trying to be strong for David, who was grieving too, but differently, more quietly, more internally. We decided to take a break from trying, to just live our lives without the monthly cycle of hope and disappointment, without timed intercourse and ovulation tracking and the weight of intention pressing down on something that was supposed to be natural and spontaneous. Maybe we'd pursue fertility treatments later. Maybe we'd look into adoption. Maybe we'd decide to be a family of 2 humans and 1 dog, and let that be enough. We didn't have to decide everything immediately. We could just be sad for a while, and see what emerged from that sadness when we were ready. Work became a refuge again, not because I was avoiding grief but because those 10-year-olds needed me to show up fully present. And there was something healing about focusing on their needs instead of my own losses. Jasmine brought me a drawing one day. A picture of a teacher helping a student climb a mountain, both figures smiling at the top. For Ms. Martinez, the best teacher, it said in careful block letters. I cried in the staff bathroom after school, grateful tears mixed with sad ones, the complicated emotional cocktail of being seen and valued while also carrying invisible wounds. That summer, David and I traveled to Japan, something we'd been talking about for years but never prioritized. We spent 2 weeks wandering through Tokyo and Kyoto, eating incredible food, sitting in ancient temples, walking through gardens that had been tended for centuries. There was something profound about being in spaces where generations had lived and died and created beauty that outlasted them, where individual suffering was acknowledged, but also contextualized within a much larger story of human existence and persistence. In a temple garden in Kyoto, sitting beside a pond where koi swam lazy circles beneath the surface, David said something that shifted everything. We're going to be okay either way. With kids or without them. We have each other, and we have a good life, and we have love that matters. That's not settling. That's not giving up. That's just acknowledging what's real right now. I leaned against him and watched the fish move through water, and felt some tight knot inside me loosen slightly. He was right. We were going to be okay. We returned home in August, tanned and rested and carrying a new perspective. I went back to school that fall with renewed energy, threw myself into curriculum development, volunteered to mentor new teachers, took on leadership responsibilities I'd been avoiding. If I was going to pour my maternal energy somewhere, It would be into these kids who needed it, into creating a classroom environment where every child felt safe and seen and valued. That was its own kind of legacy, its own way of mattering beyond myself. In October, I got a call from Brandon. The first contact I'd had with him since our mother's funeral 3 years earlier. He was awkward on the phone, clearly uncomfortable, clearly calling because he needed something rather than because he wanted to repair our relationship. He told me our father had advanced dementia, was in a memory care facility, was declining rapidly. Brandon was handling everything alone and it was overwhelming, and he wondered if I'd be willing to help, financially or otherwise. I felt that old familiar pull of obligation. The voice that had been trained into me saying family helps family, saying he's still your father, saying you'll regret it if you don't. But I also felt the stronger, newer voice that had been cultivated through therapy and experience and hard-won boundaries. That voice said you don't owe them anything. That voice said they made their choices, and these are the consequences. That voice said helping would only reopen wounds that had finally healed enough to stop hurting constantly. I told Brandon I was sorry he was dealing with that alone, that it sounded difficult, but that I wasn't able to help. He was quiet for a moment, then said what I'd expected him to say. You're really going to abandon your own father when he's dying? The old me would have felt crushed by that accusation. The current me recognized it for what it was, manipulation dressed as moral judgment. I told Brandon that our father had abandoned me long before dementia, that the man in that facility had chosen money and pride over relationship, and that I'd made peace with the distance between us. I wished Brandon well, and ended the call. David asked if I was okay after. I thought about it honestly. I was sad in an abstract way, sad that my father was suffering, sad that his life was ending in a facility without the family connection he'd destroyed through his own actions. But I wasn't guilty. I wasn't second-guessing myself. I'd extended chances for reconciliation when it might have mattered, when there might have been time to build something real. Those chances had been rejected or weaponized. I wasn't obligated to keep offering them indefinitely. So yes, I told David, I'm okay. And I was. My father died that December, quietly and apparently confused about who he was, or where he was most of the time at the end. Brandon sent a brief email informing me of the death and the funeral arrangements. I didn't respond. I didn't attend. I marked his passing the way you mark any life ending, with a moment of acknowledgement, and a release of whatever remaining emotional ties still existed. Then I went back to living my life, which felt like the most honest thing I could do. The following year brought unexpected changes. The school district offered me a position as a curriculum specialist, developing math programs across multiple schools rather than teaching in one classroom. It would mean leaving my students, which felt like a genuine loss, but it would also mean influencing how math was taught to hundreds of kids, making the subject more accessible and less intimidating, especially for the quiet ones who thought they weren't smart enough or brave enough to be good at it. I accepted the position after talking it through with David and Dr. Chun and Aunt Carol, all the people whose wisdom I'd learned to trust. It felt like growth, like using my experience and skills in a broader way, like another step in building the kind of legacy my grandmother would have approved of. On my last day in the classroom, Jasmine, now in 7th grade but visiting from the middle school, brought me a card signed by dozens of former students. Thank you for believing in us when we didn't believe in ourselves, it said. You taught us we were worth more than we thought. That went on my office wall in the new position, a reminder of why the work mattered. David and I had stopped actively trying to have children, had settled into our life as it was when I got pregnant again at 38. We didn't tell anyone for months, superstitious and scared and not ready to hope too openly. But this pregnancy held, past the 12-week mark, past 20 weeks, past viability. We started cautiously preparing, setting up a nursery in our 3rd bedroom, buying the essentials, letting ourselves imagine this specific future. Our daughter was born on a warm evening in late May, 6 pounds and 9 ounces of perfect healthy baby, who screamed her displeasure at being evicted from her comfortable home, and then settled into my arms like she'd always belonged there. We named her Rose, after my grandmother, whose full name had been Rosemary. David cried when she was placed on my chest. I cried. The nurses probably cried because birth is just emotional like that, all this raw life and vulnerability and hope concentrated in one tiny new person. Taking care of Rose was harder than anything I'd ever done, and also somehow the most natural. The sleepless nights, the constant feeding, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping this helpless creature alive and helping her thrive. It was all consuming in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. But it was also grounding, purposeful, a daily reminder that life continued, that new things grew even after loss, that hope wasn't foolish even when hope had been disappointed before. Aunt Carol came to meet Rose when she was 2 weeks old, held her carefully and smiled with tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother would have loved her so much," she said. "She would have loved knowing her legacy continued through you, through this beautiful new life." I thought about that often during those early months, thought about the chain of women in my family, my grandmother who'd built something from nothing, my mother who'd squandered what she'd been given, me trying to honor one and learn from the other's mistakes, and now Rose, who would inherit whatever I could teach her about strength and kindness, and standing up for yourself without becoming cruel. I went back to work part-time when Rose was 6 months old, arranging my curriculum specialist schedule to allow for maximum flexibility. David's company had shifted to permanent remote work, which meant he could share childcare responsibilities more equally than traditional office arrangements would have allowed. We figured it out day by day, the logistics and the exhaustion and the moments of pure joy when Rose smiled or laughed or reached some new developmental milestone that felt like proof we were doing something right. Jasmine came to visit when Rose was 8 months old, now a high school freshman thriving in advanced math courses, and talking about engineering programs at colleges I'd helped her research. She brought a gift, a children's book about a girl who loved numbers, and sat on our couch holding Rose with surprising competence for a 15-year-old. "You changed my life," she said suddenly, not looking at me, focused on Rose's tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb. "I don't know if I ever told you that. But you did. You made me believe I could be more than what my circumstances said I could be." I told her she'd done that herself, that I'd just pointed out what was already there. She shook her head. "No, you showed me what it looked like when someone believed in you for real. Not because they wanted something from you but because they genuinely saw your potential. That's what I'm going to do when I'm older. I'm going to be the person for someone else that you were for me." Watching her hold my daughter, this brilliant young woman who'd survived her own difficult family situation, and transformed it into fuel for her ambition rather than a weight that crushed her, I felt that chain of women extending forward, the legacy multiplying beyond what my grandmother could have imagined. Rose turned 1, then 2, then 3. She was fierce and funny and stubborn in ways that reminded me of myself, but also confident in ways I'd never been at her age. When she wanted something, she asked for it clearly. When something upset her, she said so directly. When adults tried to dismiss her feelings or talk over her, she stood her ground with a determination that made me proud even when it was exhausting to parent. David and I were raising her to have a voice and use it, to believe her needs and wants were legitimate, to understand that being kind didn't mean being compliant. We talked about my family situation in age-appropriate ways as Rose got older. She knew she had grandparents who'd died before she was born, knew there was an Uncle Brandon she'd never met, knew that sometimes families were complicated, and people made choices that created distance. We didn't hide the truth, but we didn't burden her with details she was too young to process. We just normalized the idea that family could look different for everyone, that chosen family was just as real as biological family, that love was about actions and consistency rather than obligation and shared DNA. The properties continued to generate steady income, allowing U.S. financial security that I never took for granted. I remembered too clearly what it felt like to check my bank account with anxiety before every purchase, to choose between necessities, to feel one emergency away from catastrophe. Rose would never have that experience unless something dramatic changed, and I worked hard to help her understand that security was a gift and a responsibility, not an entitlement. We volunteered together at food banks and homeless shelters, talked about why some people had more than others, tried to instill in her both gratitude for what we had and awareness of what others lacked. By the time Rose started kindergarten, I'd been in my curriculum specialist role for almost 5 years. The programs I'd helped develop were showing measurable results, kids across the district performing better in math, fewer students identifying as bad at numbers or afraid of the subject. It felt meaningful, this ripple effect, reaching children I'd never teach directly but still influencing through the systems and approaches I helped create. My grandmother had built housing that sheltered people. I was building educational frameworks that opened doors. Different tools, same underlying purpose of making the world slightly more navigable for people who needed support. Aunt Carol got sick when I was 42. Cancer, aggressive, the kind with poor prognosis despite treatment. She faced it with characteristic pragmatism, no self-pity, no why me, just okay, this is happening, so what needs to be done? I visited her weekly during treatment, brought meals, helped with errands, sat with her through the hard days when the chemotherapy made everything feel impossible. She talked about her life with satisfaction rather than regret, told me she'd lived well and loved fully and had no major complaints about how things had turned out. One afternoon, sitting in her living room while she napped on the couch, exhausted from treatment, I looked through old photo albums she'd pulled out to show Rose during our last visit. There were pictures of my grandmother I'd never seen, young and fierce and building her life one decision at a time. Pictures of my father as a child before whatever happened to him happened, when he still looked capable of becoming someone different. Pictures of me at various ages, some I remembered being taken and some I didn't, a visual timeline of my journey from invisible to visible, from erased to essential. Aunt Carol woke up and caught me crying over the photos. "Those are good tears, I hope," she said, her voice rough from sleep and medication. I told her they were complicated tears, sad and grateful all mixed together. She nodded understanding. "That's the thing about surviving a difficult family," she said. "You carry both the wounds and the wisdom. You can't have one without the other. But what you do with both, that's what determines whether the wounds were worth it." I asked her if she thought mine were worth it. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Look at your life, Elena. Look at Rose and David and the work you do and the person you've become." Yeah, I'd say they were worth it. Carol died 6 months later, her children and grandchildren around her, me holding one hand while her daughter held the other. She'd been the bridge to the good parts of my family history, the keeper of stories and the believer in truth, the one who'd shown me that you could survive being rejected by some family members and still build meaningful connections with others. Her death felt like losing the last thread connecting me to my grandmother, even though I knew that wasn't quite true. The real connection was internal, woven into how I made decisions and treated people and understood my place in the world. We scattered Carol's ashes in the same cemetery where my grandmother and Grandpa Frank were buried, bringing the family full circle geographically if not emotionally. Rose, now 6 years old, asked me why some of our family was buried here, but we never visited except for sad reasons. I tried to explain that these were the people who'd loved us well, who'd chosen integrity and kindness, and that we honored them by living the way they'd taught us to live. She thought about that seriously, then asked if when I died she could come visit sometimes just to talk to me. I told her yes, absolutely, but I hoped she wouldn't need to for a very long time. Life continued its forward motion, because that's what life does regardless of loss. Rose grew and David and I grew older, and the properties appreciated and my career evolved, and the world kept turning through its seasons of birth and death, and everything in between. I thought less and less about my parents and Brandon, the anger and hurt fading into something more like distant memory, something that had happened to a previous version of me who'd learned from it and moved on. On Rose's 10th birthday, the age I'd been when my grandmother was still alive, I gave her a piece of jewelry I'd been saving for this moment. It was my grandmother's key necklace, the one Aunt Carol had given me all those years ago. Rose held it carefully, examining the small silver key with appropriate reverence for something that clearly mattered. "What's it for?" she asked. I told her it was a reminder that she held the keys to her own life, that no one could lock her into being less than she was capable of being, that she got to choose who she became and how she moved through the world. She put it on immediately and hasn't taken it off since. Sometimes I see her touching it absently, the way I used to, the way my grandmother probably did. This talisman of autonomy passed down through women who'd had to fight for their right to make their own choices. Rose doesn't know yet all the specific battles that necklace represents, the legal fights and the family fractures and the painful process of choosing yourself when everyone around you says that choice is selfish. She'll learn eventually, when she's old enough to understand, but for now it's enough that she knows it matters, that it means something about strength and independence, and refusing to be diminished. I'm 45 now. Rose is 8. David and I have been married 13 years. The properties my grandmother left me are worth close to $5 million with Portland's continued appreciation. I've helped develop math curriculum used in 3 school districts. I've mentored dozens of young teachers. I've maintained boundaries with toxic family members and built chosen family with people who deserve that trust. I've survived miscarriage and grief and the long process of healing from childhood wounds that don't announce themselves as trauma until you're old enough to name them. Looking back at that morning in Riverside Bistro when my mother spilled coffee on my arm and demanded money I didn't owe, I can barely recognize the woman I was then. She was scared and small and still hoping that compliance would eventually earn her love. She documented everything as protection but hadn't yet learned that protection required action. That evidence without confrontation was just archived pain. She knew she was being wronged but hadn't yet trusted herself enough to fight back forcefully. I'm grateful to her, that earlier version of myself, for doing the hard work of documentation, even when she wasn't sure it would matter. I'm grateful to Grandpa Frank for showing up exactly when he was needed, for honoring his promise to my grandmother, for teaching me that real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself. I'm grateful to Linda and Dr. Chun and Aunt Carol, and everyone who stood beside me while I figured out how to stand on my own. I'm grateful even for my parents and Brandon in some strange way, because they showed me clearly who not to become, how not to treat people, what happens when you let greed and pride override love and integrity. The story I told at the beginning, about coffee and burns and $250,000 debts and the grandfather who saved me, that's all true. But it's also incomplete because stories don't really end. They just reach points where you pause to take stock, to see how far you've traveled, to acknowledge the distance between who you were and who you've become. This is one of those pause points. I don't know what comes next, what challenges or losses or triumphs wait in the undefined future. But I know I'll face them from a foundation my grandmother built and I reinforced, a foundation strong enough to support not just me but the people I love and the legacy I'm building forward. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. I know it's long and complicated, and doesn't have the neat resolution stories are supposed to have where everyone apologizes and families reunite, and everything gets fixed. Real life is messier than that. Real healing is slower and more complicated, and requires you to accept that some things won't be fixed, some people won't change, some relationships won't be salvaged no matter how much you might want them to be. But real life also contains more grace than we expect, more moments of unexpected joy, more people willing to show up and help and witness your journey without trying to control it. Real life gives you chances to start over, to build something new from the ruins of what was destroyed, to discover that you're stronger than you thought and more capable than anyone gave you credit for. That's what I found on the other side of family betrayal and legal battles, and the long process of learning to value myself. Not perfection or happily ever after, but something better. Authenticity, agency, a life that's genuinely mine, and that, it turns out, is worth everything I had to lose to gain it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.